Hey there. Welcome in. Wherever you are in the world, whether it's morning coffee or midnight silence, I'm really glad you're here. Before we begin, let me ask you something simple. How's your day been? Really? How's your heart? Today, are you winding down from a long shift, trying to fall asleep, studying with soft light on, or just looking for something calm to drift into? Maybe you're here by accident, or maybe the title pulled at something quiet inside you. Either way, it's the perfect time. Tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it on your clock right now? And what do you wish time felt like? Leave me a comment and let me know. I'd love to read where in the world you're tuning in from and what kind of moment you're in right now. It's always amazing seeing how far this reaches. Like we're all sitting around one giant fire, sharing thoughts in different languages at different hours, but under the same sky. So wherever you are, welcome. Get comfortable. Let everything else wait. Because tonight we're going back. Back to a time before clocks ruled our lives. Back to when time was told in stars and breath and shadow. And it starts right now. Long before gears turned and chimes rang from iron towers, before the steady tick of hands sweeping over numbers became our constant companion, humanity was alone with the sky. It was an existence woven into the fabric of nature itself, and time was not yet something external, no thing to be worn, to be stared at, to be divided into hours and minutes. Time lived in the rhythm of the world. It came with the sun, and it went with the dark. It lingered in the breath of the wind, whispered in the rustle of trees, and echoed through the stillness of the night. To understand how people told time, before clocks we must return not to a place, but to a condition, a way of being that listened, watched, and remembered. It begins around a fire, where the stories began, and where time, for our ancestors, was not counted, but felt. Imagine the first humans staring into the sky, long before writing, cities or nations, nomadic bands moving with the seasons, their lives shaped by the needs of food, shelter, and warmth. The stars above them were no mystery, not to them, for they watched them every night. They learned their paths like trails through a forest. In the silent language of constellations and moon phases, they discovered patterns. They watched the moon wax and wane. They tracked its shape like they tracked the animals they hunted. A full moon meant something different than a crescent, and they knew this, though not through words or calendars. Through experience. Perhaps someone noticed that the herds moved with the moons, or that certain plants ripened only after a full cycle. Over generations, this became knowledge, passed from one mind to another in murmured speech or gesture. This was the beginning of timekeeping, not invention, but observation. The sun was the oldest clock of all. Its rise and fall carved the day into pieces. Morning, when the light returned and warmth slowly came. Midday, when shadows vanished and the air shimmered. Evening, when the light retreated and the world turned cold again. Without the need for names, early humans divided their lives into these changes. They told time not by measuring it, but by noticing what happened when. Perhaps they gathered berries in the cool of dawn, rested in the heat of midday, and returned, to camp as the sky dimmed. The shape of a shadow, the angle of the light. These were markers more precise than numbers. A sharp-eyed hunter would know when the deer moved through the low grass, by the scent of the wind, and the slant of the sun. A gatherer would know which plants opened their flowers at noon, and which closed them by dusk. These were the hours, even if they had no names. As humans settled into more stable lives, creating villages, growing crops, raising animals, the need for more regular timekeeping emerged. But before we jump to inventions, consider how early agricultural communities depended on the year's cycle. The stars again became guides. The appearance of certain constellations marked the coming of the rains, or the time to plant. One of the oldest known examples is from the ancient Egyptians, who noticed that Sirius, the dog star, rose in the early morning sky just before the Nile flooded. This wasn't just a pretty light. It was a warning, a signal, a time marker. Long before paper and ink, time was written across the heavens. So they watched the sky, night after night, for years, for lifetimes. They handed this knowledge down, person to person, generation to generation. Time was memory. Time was story. Even among nomadic tribes, seasons mattered. The tilt of the earth, though unknown to them in terms of physics, was intimately felt. The cold months came and went with regularity. The days grew shorter or longer. People marked these changes not with tools, but with ceremonies and rituals. They gathered to honor the longest night, or to celebrate the return of the sun. These gatherings became cultural timepieces. The winter solstice, the shortest day, was not simply a curiosity. It was a hinge on which the year turned. It was hope. It meant the worst had passed, and the light would return. Many ancient monuments, such as Stonehenge in Britain or Newgrange in Ireland, align perfectly with solstice sunrises or sunsets. Built without modern tools, these structures are proof that prehistoric people understood time not only emotionally, but mathematically. They tracked the sun's position year after year until they could predict its furthest points on the horizon. And then they built in stone what they had known in heart and memory. Animals, too, were clocks. Roosters crowed before dawn. Insects sang louder in the warm months. Wolves howled in patterns that could be noticed, if not understood. Even the plants moved with time. The opening and closing of flowers, the shedding of leaves, the ripening of fruit. These were all time signals that ancient peoples read with intuitive clarity. To them, time was not abstract. It was alive, tactile, real. It was in the smoke rising from a morning fire, in the hunger that came before dusk, in the cry of a baby who always stirred at the same star's appearance. The very body, even, was a clock. Women noticed their cycles. Elders felt the seasons in their bones. Children grew and marked the passage of years without ever needing to count them. This was a time of felt time, lived time. Not exact, but entirely functional. Sleep, too, played its role. Before artificial light, people slept in two phases. A first sleep that began not long after sunset, and a second sleep that followed a midnight waking. This waking period, often lasting an hour or two, was used for prayer, sex, quiet reflection, or even simple conversation. This pattern, recorded in diaries and letters even into the early modern era, suggests that before electric time, people lived in harmony with a natural rhythm. They did not force themselves to sleep or wake by a schedule, but allowed their bodies to align with the night, the stars overhead, the fire's glow, the sounds of the forest. These were all companions to this middle night wakefulness. Even in dreams, time moved differently. People told stories of ancestors visiting, of signs given, of visions timed to the moon. This, too, was part of the temporal tapestry. Among the Inuit, where winter days could be nearly all dark and summer, days all light, time was kept by social activity, by meals, by tasks. A day might be known not by sunrise and sunset, but by the order of things done. After the seal is gutted, or when the sled returns. Among desert peoples, the movement of stars was clearer than any sundial. In jungle communities, bird calls and insect rhythms could divide the day more precisely than any ticking gear. Each culture learned to read the signs most available to them. Some used tide patterns. Some listened for the migration of frogs. Others burned sticks of uniform length and measured time in songs, a full verse of a work chant marking how long to wait before switching tasks. This was time not bound by machinery, but molded to human need and ecological familiarity. Before numbers, time was rhythm. The beat of feet on a hunting path, the sway of a boat on the tide, the number of breaths between chores. All of this formed a quiet symphony that early humans played without notation. When someone asked, "When will it be done?" the answer came not as in 30 minutes, but when the sun is this high, or after the birds return, or by the time the smoke clears. It was flexible, intuitive, alive. No one was late, for there was no clock to betray them. Time did not punish. It did not rush. It flowed like water, like wind, like thought. Even language reveals this. Ancient terms for time often describe space or motion, not discrete quantities, but relationships. And then there were the fires. Humans have long used fire as a measure. A log takes a certain amount of time to burn. A torch lasts so long. A line of oil in a lamp can guide the night's watches. In some communities, especially in Asia and the Middle East, incense sticks were burned in succession to mark periods, the length of a meeting, a meditation, a meal, all measured by the fading of smoke and scent. These timekeepers did not tick. They did not demand. They faded gently, reminding people that time was not something to conquer, but something to witness. In every gesture, in every pause, our ancestors were learning the shape of time. They measured it by what changed. The growing of shadows, the blooming of flowers, the call of a bird, the fullness of a belly, the quiet of a forest. There was no need for watches. The world was the watch. The stars were the calendar. The moon was the guide. Time was not a thing to be kept. It was a story to be told. And that, perhaps, is the most important part. Before clocks, time was story. To tell someone when to come, you told them the story of what would happen first. When the red star rises, and the dew is thick, and the old woman has sung her song, then each moment was tied to an event, a memory, a ritual. It was not impersonal, it was shared. And in the sharing, it was understood. In the quiet of ancient caves, where handprints still mark walls blackened with soot, the past breathes through. Time, not counted, not calculated, but remembered. We carry that rhythm still, in our heartbeat, our breath, our sleep. The world moves, and we still move with it. The sun had always spoken, but now humankind began to reply in stone. In the earlier ages, time was tracked through movement, of stars, of seasons, of instinct. But there came a moment in our long journey where people no longer wanted to merely follow time. They wanted to anchor it. They wanted to pin it to the earth. The idea that the sky's rhythm could be etched into the land was a revolution, though it came not from conquest or science, but from attention. Generations of looking upward, generations of noticing. And so, the second great chapter of timekeeping began, not with the ticking of gears, but with the silent stretching of shadows. Long before numbered hours or handheld watches, there were gnomons, upright sticks or stones planted into the earth, to mark how the sun moved. Simple, almost laughably so in modern eyes, and yet profoundly effective. A shadow cast in the morning pointed west. By noon, it grew shortest. By evening, it stretched eastward. And from these shifts, people understood time not as a mystery, but as a pattern. Visible, repeatable, useful. The very word gnomon would later come from the Greek meaning one who knows. And indeed, a well-placed gnomon knew more about the day than any person. It revealed the sun's arc across the heavens. It drew lines across the soil, which, if watched and remembered, could divide a day into segments. These segments would eventually become hours, but that concept was still far away. At first, what mattered was not the numbers, but the knowing. When the shadow touched the mark near the hut's door, it was time to feed the animals. When it crossed the rock near the river, it was time to pray. These moments shaped life long before clocks claimed ownership of time. From sticks came stones. From marks in dust came grooves carved in rock. And soon, the observation of shadows became a craft. In the lands of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Fertile Crescent gave rise to cities and writing, some of the first real instruments of time emerged. The Babylonians were masters of celestial observation, and in their ziggurats, towering temple structures, priests would ascend to watch the heavens and measure time's flow, not only by stars but by shadow. They created vertical sundials, simple yet refined, to measure daylight hours. In Babylon, where time and astronomy were married to ritual, the shadow's movement was no longer merely practical. It was sacred. Each hour, though not equal in length throughout the year, was tied to divine cycles. Time was now being named, categorized, and structured. Not fully standardized, not yet bound to the modern grid, but shaped into something repeatable, and thus controllable. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, the same sun that baked the stone of pyramids also shaped the concept of temporal order. The Egyptians, surrounded by desert and the regular pulse of the Nile, were deeply attuned to cycles of flood, of drought, of death and rebirth. Their culture, steeped in rhythm, needed a more refined sense of daytime. They constructed shadow clocks, which used a long bar casting a shadow on a calibrated surface to divide the day into parts. Some were portable, carried by priests or officials, aligning their days with celestial order. Others were fixed near temples, where the movement of time aligned with the movement of ritual. Noon was marked when a shadow disappeared beneath the gnomon. Morning and evening were measured by how far the shadow crept along inscribed lines. These instruments were the beginning of diurnal division, the slicing of daytime into readable chunks. They knew that the sun's height and the shape of its shadow could give a kind of language to time. Still, their hours were not equal across the seasons. The Egyptians, like other ancient peoples, accepted time as fluid, stretching in summer, shrinking in winter. A day had 12 parts regardless of how long the sun stayed in the sky. Thus, the hour was born not as a fixed measure, but as a portion of experience. Stone, in its silence, became the great recorder of these rhythms. Across the ancient world, great monoliths began to rise, not for shelter, not for war, but for time. Consider the mystery of Stonehenge, standing upon the Salisbury Plain, its great stones aligned to the solstices. This monument, constructed over many generations beginning around 3000 BCE, reveals an astonishing truth. People of the Neolithic world, long before metal tools or written calendars, could track solar and lunar cycles with precision. On the summer solstice, the sun rises directly above the heel stone, its light piercing the center of the stone circle. On the winter solstice, it sets between another alignment of stones. These events were not merely beautiful. They were signals. The sun's movement marked agricultural readiness, ritual timing, and perhaps the very turning of the year. The builders of Stonehenge were astronomers, engineers, artists, and timekeepers. The circle was not a clock in the modern sense, but it marked time in the language of shadow and alignment, of light and silence. Similar stone structures, often called megalithic observatories, exist in other parts of the world, from the Bain Passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, where a beam of sunlight enters only on the winter solstice, to the Nabta Playa Circle in Egypt's desert, built even before Stonehenge. Each of these structures shows an understanding of time rooted not in abstraction, but in place, a kind of clock embedded into the landscape. The Chinese, too, developed ingenious shadow-based instruments. As early as 800 BCE, they created sundials that could measure time accurately across the seasons. Their designs included horizontal plates with marked lines and vertical gnomons adjusted for the sun's seasonal altitude. Some advanced sundials in ancient China were incorporated into water clocks, fusing two modes of timekeeping into a more reliable measure. Time here was not just watched, but engineered. In a civilization that valued harmony with heaven, these instruments were used not merely to know the time of day, but to align human activity with cosmic order. Astronomers, working under the mandate of heaven, ensured that calendars and timekeeping served the empire's stability. Their accuracy was essential. A misalignment of time could signal a loss of divine favor. In India, the ancient Vedic texts show that timekeeping was part of sacred knowledge. Priests known as Brahmins conducted rituals precisely timed with lunar phases and solar positions. Later, during the medieval period, structures like the Jantar, Mantar, a vast astronomical observatory built in the 18th century, though rooted in older traditions, used massive stone instruments to track celestial bodies. These were not merely scientific tools, they were expressions of cosmic faith. The sundials in these observatories, particularly the Samrat Yantra in Jaipur, could tell time to a precision of 2 seconds. It was the culmination of centuries of watching shadows move across carved stone, of seeing time as something both spiritual and scientific. The Greeks refined these traditions further. Their philosophers, fascinated by geometry and the movement of the heavens, designed sundials based on careful measurements of latitude and solar arc. Anaximander, around 560 BCE, is credited with introducing the gnomon to Greece, possibly from Babylon. Soon, public sundials were set up in city squares, near temples, and on the steps of amphitheaters. The Tower of the Winds in Athens, built in the 2nd century BCE, featured multiple sundials and even a water clock inside. Here, time became civic. It was no longer solely the domain of priests or farmers. Citizens could walk past a shadow on stone and know the hour. A new relationship was forming, one where time could be shared publicly, argued over, scheduled. The sundial made time visible to all, and that changed everything. Yet the sundial, for all its elegance, had limits. It needed sunlight. It changed with the seasons. It required interpretation. And so, alongside it, people began to search for ways to stabilize time, to make it run in darkness, in cloud, in stillness. But even as water clocks and candles emerged, the sundial remained a symbol, the world's first deliberate attempt to carve time out of chaos. But the most enduring thing about this age of shadows and stones was not its precision. It was its poetry. Imagine standing before one of these ancient sundials. You see a shadow crawling slowly across the stone. You know because your father told you that when it reaches that notch, the flock must be fed. Your mother says, when it crosses that line, the baker will ring the bell. The entire day unfolds not from a bell tower, not from a screen, but from a dance of light on stone. There is no tick, no buzz, no digital interruption. Just the sun, the shadow, the stone, and you. This was time not dictated but revealed, and the monuments, they endure still, silent as they always were, watching the sky. Each morning, as light returns, their shadows stretch long and then shrink again, as they have done for thousands of years. We walk among them, cameras in hand, marveling at their alignment, their mystery. But what we often forget is that they were built not just to measure time, but to embody it, to hold it, to make sure it passed in a way people could trust. They stand as proof that long before clocks, people had already found ways to bind themselves to the rhythm of the earth. Not by force, not by calculation, but by observing, by listening, by marking the moments that mattered. Time, in those days, was a kind of communion. It was shared, between humans and sun, between stone and season, between shadow and meaning. It asked you to watch, not to rush, to understand, not to dominate. Before we turned time into something we owned, before we imprisoned it in metal and numbers, we honored it. We built temples to its passage. We carved its angles into our altars. We let it move slowly as it wished. And perhaps in that, there is something worth remembering still. In the quiet spaces between stone and shadow, when clouds veiled the sky and night consumed the land, humankind reached for a different kind of time. It was not celestial, not drawn across the heavens in arcs of light, or traced through the slow stretch of a gnomon silhouette. It was tactile. It was intimate. It moved not in vast cosmic sweeps, but in the steady drip, the silent fall, the measured burn. This was time as movement, not of sun or star, but of substance. Water seeping from vessel to vessel, sand sliding in a glass belly, oil flickering inside clay lamps, incense turning to ash. In these instruments, early people found a way to summon time into darkness, to conjure its presence indoors, at night, and during ritual. It was the birth of artificial timekeeping, and it flowed not with gears, but with gravity. It is impossible to say precisely when the first water clock emerged. No single culture claims its invention. Instead, it appears again and again across the ancient world, like a thought whose time had come. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Persia, in India and China, everywhere people needed to track time when the sun was gone, they turned to water. And the logic was simple. A container with a small hole, filled with water, would empty in a predictable manner. Measure the water's descent, or collect its output, and you measure time. Simple, yes, but the implications were profound. Suddenly, time could be controlled. Not just watched, but designed. People no longer had to rely on light. With a bowl and a hole, they could track minutes, or their ancient equivalents, even in a sealed chamber. The earliest Egyptian water clocks, known as clepsydrae, from the Greek words kleptine, to steal, and hydor, water, date back to the 16th century BCE. They were used by temple priests to determine the proper hours for rituals, offerings, and celestial observations. These were not the clunky hourglasses of modern imagination, but elegant basins with carefully incised markings on the interior. As water drained slowly, the descending level would pass these marks, indicating the passage of time. These marks weren't equally spaced, for ancient Egyptian hours varied with the season. Shorter nights in summer required faster division. Longer nights in winter meant more spacing between measures. This reveals something deeper. Time, to them, was not fixed. It was adaptive, living. The water did not flow in defiance of nature's rhythm. It flowed with it. In Babylon, water clocks likely aided astronomers in calculating planetary positions, eclipses, and rituals associated with celestial cycles. Time here was part of governance, of fate, of empire. The drip of water could decide when to hold court, when to begin planting, when to align one's prayers with the stars. By measuring night in controlled intervals, kings ensured their calendars matched divine expectation. Time became political, religious, and personal. These clocks gave priests authority, for they alone could interpret their meanings, maintain their function, and guard their accuracy. A sacred trust formed between the vessel and the temple. Across the ancient Mediterranean, the Greeks would eventually refine the clepsydra into more complex instruments. Some collected water in a lower bowl, marking time as volume increased. Others used float mechanisms and dials to offer visual cues. They became courtroom tools. In Athens, lawyers had limited time to argue their cases, and so water clocks were used to ensure fairness. The vessel would be filled, the hole opened, and the case would begin. When the last drop fell, the speaker was finished. This was time as justice, time as balance, time not only observed, but enforced. Yet it was not only the Greeks or the Babylonians who embraced fluid time. Far away in India and China, similar tools evolved, each shaped by their unique cosmologies. In ancient India, the Gaudiya system divided a day into 60 equal parts, each roughly 24 minutes long. Water clocks called gati yantras were used in temples and astronomical observatories to time daily rituals. These devices, often consisting of copper bowls with holes set afloat in large water-filled vessels, sank gradually as water filled them, from below. Priests would note each submersion and raise a new bowl, marking the rhythm of prayer, sacrifice, or celestial observation. Here, time was both sacred and cyclical. It did not march forward. It turned like a wheel. In China, timekeeping became a high art. As early as 400 BCE, Chinese engineers were constructing clepsydræ with remarkable complexity. These devices featured controlled flow systems, gears, and even escapements, mechanical, regulators that foreshadowed the workings of later clocks. During the Han Dynasty, engineer Zhang Heng is said to have developed advanced water clocks that included compensatory systems for seasonal changes in water flow, accounting for freezing in winter or evaporation in summer. The Chinese also merged water timekeeping with astronomical modeling. During the Tang and Song dynasties, tower clocks used flowing water to power rotating celestial spheres, showing the movement of planets and stars in real time. These clocks were not merely timers. They were machines of the cosmos. They mirrored the heavens. They made time visible, moving, mechanical, a vision that would not appear in Europe for many more centuries. But water was not the only element that could flow. There was also sand. The hourglass, so familiar now as a symbol of mortality and patience, likely emerged much later than the clepsydra. Its origins are murky, perhaps medieval Europe, perhaps earlier. But the principle is elegant. A narrow neck connects two glass bulbs. As sand trickles from the upper chamber to the lower, time passes. The hourglass had certain advantages. It was portable, unaffected by temperature, and precise in measuring short intervals. Sailors used it aboard ships to measure watch times and record speed through the water. It became a tool of navigation, of exploration, and later, of industry. Yet the hourglass had a symbolic power as well. In religious art, it stood for the fleeting nature of life. In science, it represented measure and control. But long before the hourglass took its familiar shape, ancient people were already pouring time through grains. In Persia, the use of sand clocks is documented alongside water timekeeping. Some scholars suggest that early models used sand in place of water where freezing was a risk. But sand was more difficult to control. Its flow was less stable, affected by moisture and grain size. Only with improved glassmaking and understanding of particulate behavior did the hourglass become viable. When it did, it spread rapidly. Across monasteries, seafaring vessels, workshops, and eventually into households. It measured sermons, boiled eggs, candlelit prayers, a curious union of the cosmic and the domestic. But time could also burn. Fire, one of humanity's oldest companions, became yet another means of tracking the invisible drift of moments. Oil lamps, when filled with a consistent measure and wick, burned for predictable lengths. In many cultures, these became informal timers. A lamp burning low meant the night had progressed. A second lamp lit might mark a new phase of study or meditation. In East Asia, particularly in China and Japan, incense clocks became refined tools. Sticks or coils of incense were crafted with specific burn durations, an hour, a quarter hour, more. As the scent filled a chamber, the line of smoke retreated slowly toward the next segment. Some clocks used segmented incense paths shaped like mazes or spirals, each turn marking another unit of time. These were used by scholars, monks, and physicians. The scent was not just a byproduct, it was part of the experience. Time here was olfactory. It had texture, presence. In Buddhist temples, monks used incense timers to regulate chants and meditations. One stick might signal the beginning of silent reflection. Another might end it. The timing of meals, the changing of robes, the performance of ceremonies, all could be governed by slow, steady combustion. Fire, in this context, was not destruction. It was discipline. It brought light, yes, but also structure. The curling trail of incense smoke was both beautiful and binding, a visible tether between action and time. Some of the most inventive fire clocks came from medieval China, where candles were marked with notches or embedded with metal balls that dropped into trays as the wax melted, producing a chime. These alarm systems could signal the end of a study session or the beginning of a new task. Time now had sound. The clock did not merely show time, it spoke. One could hear the moment arrive, not just see it. The line between ritual and mechanism blurred. Each of these methods, water, sand, oil, incense, fire, reflected more than technical ingenuity. They revealed how people understood time differently across cultures. To the Egyptians, it was sacred flow. To the Greeks, a matter of balance. To the Chinese, harmony with the heavens. To the Indian priest, a wheel. To the sailor, a guide through fog. None of these saw time as we do today, rigid, numeric, uniform. Instead, they saw it in textures, in elements, in transformations. Time could drip, slide, burn, evaporate. It was not one thing, it was many. And these tools, though primitive to modern minds, carried immense psychological and cultural weight. A dripping clepsydra marked the night's watch in a royal court. A floating bowl determined when to sing or sit in meditation. An incense coil drew a spiral path through the air while scholars copied scriptures beneath its scent. These instruments shaped how people felt time, not as something they controlled, but as something they lived within. Time was not an enemy to be beaten, but a rhythm to be followed. It did not press down. It pulled gently. A guide, not a master. Yet as human ambition grew, so too did the desire to refine time further. What began as a drip would someday become a tick. What flowed would soon revolve in gears and springs. The age of mechanical clocks was on the horizon. But for thousands of years, it was these elemental tools that governed the world. In temples, on ships, in courts, and homes. And if you close your eyes and listen, you can still hear it. The drip of water in a clay bowl, the rustle of falling sand, the whisper of incense fading into air. That was time once. Quiet, steady, alive. This installment explores how human beings began to understand and mark time, not only through nature and technology, but through belief. How sacred rituals, religious calendars, and spiritual practices became some of the oldest and most enduring ways of telling time. Before the clock tower rose above the city, before the tolling of bells announced the turning of hours, time belonged to the sacred. It echoed not from iron gongs, but from chants in temples, from candles lit in cathedrals, from drums beaten in jungle shrines, and prayers whispered beneath desert stars. Long before time was measured by minutes, it was shaped by meaning. In every corner of the ancient world, in every faith and philosophy, time was woven into ritual, not simply to mark its passing, but to sanctify it. The cycle of day and night, the flow of the seasons, the motions of sun, moon, and stars. These were not just celestial phenomena, but divine messages. The sacred calendar was the first calendar, and the gods were the first keepers of time. In wine. The early temples of Mesopotamia, where priests stood atop ziggurats to watch the stars, time was already inseparable from worship. They did not gaze skyward merely for curiosity. They watched for omens, alignments, patterns believed to carry the will of the divine. Lunar months were tracked carefully to time offerings, festivals, and sacrifices. The Babylonian calendar, with its months beginning at each new moon, aligned human activity with the rhythm of the heavens. Certain constellations were linked to deities. The appearance of Venus in the morning sky marked significant ritual dates, especially in connection with the goddess Inanna. The entire machinery of religion depended on time, not on seconds, but on sacred sequence. Prayers were offered not randomly, but when the sky instructed. And in this way, time became a covenant, a shared language between mortals and gods. In Egypt, where the Nile's flooding governed the heartbeat of the land, the sacred year was divided not just agriculturally, but religiously. The Heliacol, rising of Sirius, that bright star who emerged before dawn in midsummer, was not simply an astronomical event. It marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year. The river would rise, the fields would drink, and life would be renewed. This pattern became part of the religious imagination. Osiris, the dying and reborn god, mirrored the cycles of the Nile. Temples held calendars carved into stone, each day inscribed with divine meanings, lucky or unlucky omens, holy days of feast or fasting. Priests maintained precise timing for rituals using water clocks. They had to, the gods expected precision. A misaligned offering could disturb the harmony of Mayat, the cosmic order. Even funerary rites, especially in the elaborate embalming process, followed strict timing rituals, with certain prayers and actions taking place only during particular hours of the night or phases of the moon. Time, for the Egyptians, was not merely a measurement. It was an offering. To perform time properly was to keep the universe from unraveling. Among the ancient Hebrews, time was central to identity. The creation story itself begins with a sequence: 6 days of labor, 1 of rest. This 7-day week, later echoed across much of the world, formed a cornerstone of their calendar and religious life. The Sabbath was not just a day off. It was a sanctuary in time. At sundown on Friday, all work ceased. Candles were lit, bread was blessed. The home became a temple. Time itself became holy. In Jewish tradition, festivals were timed according to the lunar calendar. Passover at the first full moon of spring, Yom Kippur 10 days into the new year, Sukkot during the harvest. Each festival retold history, embodied memory, reconnected the people with their story. Time here was not linear. It was cyclical, woven with meaning. The moon told them when to weep, when to fast, when to dance. And these rhythms sustained them through exile, dispersion, survival. In a world that changed around them, sacred time remained. Christianity inherited much from this tradition, but added new layers of symbolism and structure. The early church developed its calendar around the life of Christ. His birth, death, and resurrection became temporal anchors. Advent, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. Each marked not only seasons of the year, but movements of the soul. The liturgical calendar became a spiritual map. Monasteries especially became temples of time. Within cloistered walls, time was divided by bells: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. These canonical hours structured the day around prayer. A monk awoke in the darkness to chant psalms at matins, watched the light return as lauds rose with the dawn, paused from labor at sext to reflect beneath the noonday sun. In these communities, the clock did not rule. Prayer did. And yet, ironically, it was these monks, devoted to a timeless God, who helped give rise to the first mechanical clocks. For they needed accuracy, not for commerce, but for devotion. The ringing of bells had to be just. The hours had to be kept. The divine office demanded order. And so slowly gears and escapements emerged from within sacred walls. In Islam too, time is sacred, divinely orchestrated and precisely observed. The 5 daily prayers, or salat, form the very skeleton of the devout Muslim's day. Each prayer is performed at a specific time, determined not by mechanical means, but by the position of the sun. Fajr at dawn, Duhur after the sun passes its zenith, Asr in the late afternoon, Maghrib at sunset, Isha after nightfall. These prayers anchor believers to the cycle of day and night, turning the passage of time into moments of worship. In medieval Islamic cities, timekeepers known as muwaqqits worked within mosques to determine accurate prayer times. They used sundials, quadrants, and astronomical tables to calculate the sun's movement. In many ways, they were both scientists and spiritual guides, reminding their communities when to pause, when to reflect, when to kneel. The Islamic calendar, too, is lunar, 12 months, each beginning with the sighting of the new moon. Ramadan, the month of fasting, begins not on a fixed date, but when the crescent is seen. Time here is lived through the eyes, through the heart, not forced by artificial regularity, but guided by nature, by sky. The rhythm is divine, not mechanical. In India, where Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism developed elaborate cosmologies, time was often imagined on a scale far greater than hours and days. The concept of kalpas, immense cycles of creation and destruction, dwarfed the scope of most timekeeping. A kalpa could span billions of years. Yet within this vastness, there was also intense precision. Rituals were timed to the movement of stars. A puja might begin at the exact moment a certain planet rose. Auspicious days were determined by astrology. Weddings, journeys, even haircuttings were guided by celestial charts. Hindu temples employed priests and astronomers who maintained complex almanacs known as panchang. In Buddhism, the monastic day followed a precise schedule: meditation at dawn, alms at mid-morning, study and labor in the afternoon, chanting in the evening. In Theravada traditions, full moons marked days of intensified practice. In Mahayana, temples, giant drums, or gongs mark the hours, not with numbers, but with sound. Long tones echoing through courtyards, reminding monks and nuns to return to the present. Time was breath. Time was discipline. Time was a path. Among indigenous peoples around the world, sacred time was often tied directly to nature. Among the Maya, the calendar was a sacred structure. Two systems intertwined: the 260-day ritual calendar, Tzolk'in, and the 365-day solar calendar, Hab. Every day had a name, a number, a spirit. Certain days were good for planting, others for war, others for rest. Priests, called daykeepers, interpreted these calendars, performing ceremonies to align society with cosmic forces. Time here was not abstract. It was alive, each day a being, each number a personality. In the Andes, the Inca Empire used a similar sacred calendar system, deeply connected to the movement of the sun across mountain peaks. Certain stones were placed in such a way that on solstices, the sunlight would strike them perfectly. These were not just solar observatories, they were temples. Time was not only measured here, it was honored. In Africa, many tribal societies tied timekeeping to communal rituals. The planting season began with a dance, not a date. Rain ceremonies, coming-of-age rites, funerals, and harvests marked the passing of time in ways that were remembered in song, in myth, in performance. Among the Dogon of Mali, elaborate cosmologies guided agricultural and spiritual calendars. Among the Igbo of Nigeria, the 4-day market week created a rhythm not just of commerce, but of culture. Time was not isolated to individuals. It belonged to the community. It was relational, not numerical. In this, it echoed something universal, that time is most meaningful when shared. The sacred rhythms of time helped people endure. In times of suffering, they offered structure. In times of joy, they amplified celebration. Sacred time did not rush. It did not demand. It invited. It circled. Even in modern secular life, echoes of this old rhythm remain. Christmas and Easter, Ramadan and Diwali, Rosh Hashanah and Vesak. These are not just dates. They are anchors. They remind us that time can still be meaningful, that the year can still tell a story, that the cycle of light and dark, feast and fast, death and rebirth, still lives in us. Today, we are ruled by seconds. We wear time on our wrists. We measure it in productivity. We fear its loss. But there was once a time when time itself was sacred. When the rising sun meant prayer. When the moon's fullness brought a festival. When the burning of a candle marked not just an hour, but a hope. And if you close your eyes, even now, you might hear it. A bell calling monks to matins, a muezzin calling the faithful to fajr, a drum beating beneath a sacred tree. That was time once. Not a countdown, not a deadline, but a rhythm, shared, sung, believed. Time, for most of human history, was a companion, something that flowed beside you, arrived gently with the dawn, lingered in the stretch of a shadow, dissolved in the rhythm of prayer. But at a certain point, the relationship began to change. No longer was time something observed from nature or felt in ritual. It became something else, something that ticked, something that clicked, something built. A mechanical voice began to whisper where once only wind and bells had spoken. And in that whisper began a revolution, the birth of the clock. Not as a sundial, not as a bowl of water or a path of incense, but as a machine. And with it came a new kind of time, not sacred, not seasonal, but measured, regulated, numbered. Time became a tool, and then a master. The path to mechanical timekeeping did not begin with gears, but with questions. Monks, those quiet keepers of sacred hours, had long relied on the stars, candles, and water clocks to regulate their devotions. But these methods, though functional, required constant tending. A water clock must be refilled. A candle must be watched. A human hand was always involved, adjusting, correcting. What they needed was a way for time to move on its own, to measure itself. And so, in the shadows of monasteries, amid scrolls and scripture, an idea slowly took shape. It was the escapement, a device that would allow energy to be released in controlled increments, converting potential energy into a steady, ticking pulse. This was no small invention. It was the heartbeat of the mechanical clock. And though the precise origin is debated, with designs appearing in Islamic, Chinese, and European sources across centuries, it was in 13th century Europe that the first mechanical clocks truly began to emerge. These early clocks had no faces. They had no hands. They rang bells. That was their voice. Sound, not sight. A weight would descend, slowly unwinding a rope, releasing gears through a verge escapement, and striking a bell at regular intervals. In monasteries, this sound replaced the watchful eye. Monks could rise, pray, eat, and sleep to the rhythm of a machine. It did not falter. It did not forget. It ticked forward through rain and darkness. And in doing so, it changed the way people related to the hours. No longer were they waiting for a bell to be rung. Now, they were being called by a machine. Time had become independent, detached from the sun, the stars, even the human hand. It had a life of its own. And soon, that life would grow louder as the 14th century unfolded. These mechanical clocks leapt from monastery to marketplace. Cities began installing large public clocks, not merely to tell time, but to organize it. In towns like Milan, Strasbourg, and London, clock towers rose like monuments to the new age. Their gears turned massive wheels. Their weights dropped through chambers of stone. Bells tolled from their heights, echoing across rooftops and into alleyways. Time now had authority. It could command laborers to begin and end their work. It could announce curfew. It could count the hours of commerce. The clock tower was more than a machine. It was a symbol, a reminder that time belonged no longer to priests or peasants or nature. It belonged to the city. In England, the clock. At Salisbury Cathedral, was one of the earliest of these machines, built around 1386. It had no dial. It struck the hours with resounding clarity. Later, in the town of Wells, a mechanical figure known as Jack Blandifers would strike the bell with a hammer, adding a theatrical element to time's tolling. In Prague, the astronomical clock not only marked the hours, but displayed the movement of planets, the phases of the moon, the signs of the zodiac, a dazzling fusion of science, faith, and mechanics. Crowds gathered to watch the figures move. Time became spectacle, but beneath the beauty lay precision. The clock's true power was not its showmanship, but its regularity. It divided the day into hours of equal length, a radical shift. In earlier systems, hours changed with the seasons, longer in summer, shorter in winter. But mechanical clocks knew nothing of solstice or equinox. Their hours were fixed, 60 minutes each, 60 seconds within. This regularity changed the rhythm of life. Work could be timed, meetings scheduled, bells rung on the dot. Farmers began rising not with the cock's crow, but with the strike of a bell. Markets opened at the 6th hour. Prayers were said at noon, not because the sun stood high, but because the gear clicked forward. Time was no longer something you watched. It was something that happened to you. This shift touched every part of society. In universities, lectures were timed. In workshops, apprentices learned to measure hours, not just tasks. In homes, wealthy, merchants began acquiring their own clocks, elaborate, ornate symbols of modernity. These were not yet pendulum clocks. Their accuracy was still limited, but they marked a change. People began to see time not as a flowing river, but as a series of units, hours to be filled, to be spent. The language changed. You no longer lived through the day. You used it, or lost it. And with time came money. The rise of capitalism in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance coincided with this new ability to measure work. A laborer could be paid by the hour. A merchant could charge for a service based on time rendered. The minute became currency. The day became divisible. The factory, that great engine of the modern age, was already taking shape in the mind. The bell that once called monks to matins now called workers to mills. In the workshops of 15th century Italy and Germany, clockmakers refined their craft. They began adding dials, circular faces with hands that turned. Now, for the first time, people could see time passing, not just hear it. The hour hand rotated slowly. Later, the minute hand would join it. The ticking became visible. Clocks began to appear in private homes, their cases carved from walnut and oak, their gears hand-forged from brass and steel. They became status, symbols, proof not only of wealth, but of intellectual sophistication. To own a clock was to own time itself, and in the same centuries, across Europe, the mechanical mind of time continued to evolve. Escapements became more efficient. Spring-driven clocks replaced the heavy weights, making timekeeping more compact. In 1656, Christian Huygens would develop the first pendulum clock, a marvel of precision that reduced error from minutes per day to mere seconds. The age of true accuracy had arrived, but with it came something deeper, an internalization of the tick. No longer did people merely organize their lives by the clock. They began to think like clocks. Regularity, discipline, punctuality, these became virtues. Time was not just measured, it measured you. The Enlightenment adored the clock. Philosophers described the universe itself as a vast mechanism, a divine clock set in motion by the Creator. The human body was a machine, the state a regulator, society a ticking network of productive parts. The metaphor was complete. Time and reason, gears and logic, they merged. And beneath it all, in workshops and towers, the escapement ticked on. But not everyone embraced this change. Poets mourned the loss of natural rhythm. mystics spoke of a world now governed not by seasons, but by seconds. The Romantic era would later recoil from mechanization, yearning again for moonlight and birdsong, for the kind of time that breathes. But it was too late. The clock had won. Time had been conquered. It marched across cities, invaded schools, factories, railroads. Schedules replaced stories, hours replaced happenings. The bell that once sang for God now rang for profit. And yet, in the face of that transformation, there remained something wondrous. The clock, for all its tyranny, was also a masterpiece. A cathedral in brass, a miracle of movement. It gave humans the power to chart the stars, to map the oceans, to conduct orchestras, to fly. In the ticking of the clock, the heartbeat of the modern world began. And though we may lament the loss of softer hours, we must also marvel at the machine that made the future possible. From a shadow on the ground to a bell in a tower, from a bowl of water to a wristwatch glowing in the dark, the journey of timekeeping is the story of how humans learned to hold the intangible. We shape time with stone, with flame, with wheel and gear. And though we may never escape its grasp, we did something extraordinary. We built the rhythm of the world and listened as it ticked. Time once belonged to the village. It rose with the hills, fell behind forests, crept slowly across the market square as the sun made its daily arc. It was local, stubbornly, charmingly local. Every town had its own noon. The church bell rang, when the sexton saw the sun reach its peak, not when a distant authority said it must. Two villages, a mere dozen miles apart, might differ by several minutes, and no one cared. The world moved by horses and footsteps, and time was a matter of habit, of ritual, not of precision. Then came the train. The steam engine did more than move people. It shattered distance. Where once a journey took days, now it could be done in hours. But speed created a problem. Trains needed schedules, dependable, coordinated, precise. A timetable built on local time was a chaos of contradictions. A train leaving Bristol at noon might arrive in London at 11:53, though it had traveled forward. Each city's clock declared its own truth, and the faster people moved, the more glaring the confusion became. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Without a unified system, two trains on a single track might interpret T15 differently and meet with steel and flame. Time, once personal and poetic, had become a logistical hazard. Railway companies, particularly in England and the United States, were among the first to demand a new order. In the 1840s, British Railways began adopting a single standard time, based on the clock at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. This railway time, as it was first called, ignored the local sun. It obeyed the tick of a far-off master. Station masters synchronized their clocks to Greenwich, and passengers slowly adjusted their minds. The change was not without resistance. Some towns kept two clocks, one for the trains, one for the townspeople. But the tide had turned. For the first time in history, people were expected to bend their sense of time to a common external reference. Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, became more than a convenience. It became a framework. In 1884, at the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C., representatives from 25 nations met to solve a growing crisis: how to organize global time in the age of telegraphs, ships, and empire. After much debate, they declared the prime meridian would pass through Greenwich. From this line, the world would be divided into 24 time zones, each spanning 15 degrees of longitude. Each zone differed by exactly 1 hour from the next. It was an audacious reimagining of time, no longer tied to the sky, but to a map. Noon might fall with the sun, or not. What mattered now was coordination. The Earth, round and fluid, was chopped into vertical slices, each regulated not by local observation, but by decree. In theory, it was perfect. In practice, it was messy. Political boundaries refused to obey longitudinal lines. Cities near time zone borders had to choose allegiance, sometimes by seconds, sometimes by hours. France, defiant, kept Paris time, for decades after GMT was declared standard. In India, a half-hour offset was chosen, placing the nation between two zones. In Nepal, even today, the offset is 45 minutes, a deliberate act of national distinction. Time, once a shared, natural rhythm, had become geopolitical. The world had once moved by the pace of hooves and footsteps, of clouds drifting across the sun and the quiet growing of crops. Time had been flexible, rooted in the sky above each village, the rhythm of each land. But by the middle of the 19th century, humanity had built something faster than wind, louder than thunder, the railway. And with it came a challenge that no water clock, no sundial, and no sacred chant could resolve. The train demanded order. It demanded simultaneity. It demanded that time, once scattered and local, personal and spiritual, be made uniform. The train didn't care that noon in one town was 10 minutes off from the next. It couldn't wait for a priest to ring the bell when the sun touched the steeple. The railway ran on steel and coal, and soon, time itself would be forged in iron. In Satordwarinyor, those early days of industrial travel, time was a mess. Each town kept its own version of the hour, based on when the sun reached its highest point in the sky. For centuries, this had been good enough. A rider moving by horse might not even notice. A few minutes difference between one town and the next. But now, a train could travel from Manchester to London in a matter of hours, passing through dozens of towns, each with its own definition of now. Scheduling arrivals and departures became a nightmare. Worse, it was dangerous. Two trains, on a single line, could miscalculate by just a few minutes and collide. The train wasn't just moving people, it was forcing a complete redefinition of time itself. The answer, at least in Britain, came from a quiet hill in Greenwich. The Royal Observatory had been keeping time for navigators and astronomers for decades, using a system known as Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, a standardized measure of the average solar time at the prime meridian. It had never been meant to govern daily life. But the railways needed it. Starting in the 1840s, British railway companies began abandoning local time in favor of GMT, which they called railway time. Conductors synchronized their watches to the observatory clock. Stations installed standardized clocks, and slowly, reluctantly, towns adjusted. Some resisted. In Bristol, 2 clocks were mounted on the same tower, one for local time and one for railway time. But the momentum was irreversible. The railways had tied distant places together, and with that physical link came a new, invisible thread: coordinated time. The situation in the United States was even more chaotic. With a vast landscape and no central authority on time, by the 1870s there were over 50 different local times across the rail networks. Arriving in one city could mean adjusting your watch by minutes, or by hours. This was more than inconvenient. It undermined commerce, communication, and travel. 1883, American railroad companies took matters into their own hands. On November 18th of that year, known thereafter as the Day of Two Noons, the major railroads adopted a standardized system of 4 time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. At precisely noon in each zone, stations reset their clocks. Church bells rang. People paused, and for the first time, vast swathes of the country ticked in unison. It was not a government decision. It was business. The railroad had become the new cathedral, and its altar required precise offerings of time. The logic of time zones had already been proposed globally. In 1879, Canadian engineer and inventor Sir Sanford Fleming had suggested dividing the world into 24 time zones, each representing 1 hour of the Earth's rotation. It was a simple, elegant solution to a sprawling problem. But agreement was needed. And so, in 1884, representatives from 25 nations gathered in Washington, D.C. for the International Meridian Conference. There, after heated debate, Greenwich was chosen as the prime meridian. The line that passed through the Royal Observatory would become the anchor of the global clock. The Earth would be sliced into 24 wedges, each 15 degrees of longitude apart, each 1 hour ahead or behind its neighbor. Midnight in Greenwich would ripple outward, transforming night and day into something international, mechanical, coordinated. Not all countries immediately complied. France, proud of its astronomical tradition, clung to Paris time for decades. Colonial powers shaped time zones in their image, sometimes dividing regions unnaturally to align with imperial capitals. In India, a half-hour offset was chosen, splitting the country between zones and giving rise to Indian Standard Time. Nepal went further still, choosing an offset of 45 minutes, staking its temporal independence from both British India and China. Time zones became not just mathematical conveniences, but political tools. Time, once personal and provincial, now carried national identity. Meanwhile, the telegraph was reshaping communication, just as the train had reshaped movement. Messages could now cross continents in moments. But what was now in New York when it was midnight in London? The telegraph demanded an answer. It needed a shared present. Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC, would eventually emerge as the successor to GMT, using atomic clocks rather than celestial bodies as its foundation. But the principle remained the same. One Earth, one system, many zones. It was no longer acceptable for each town to invent its own hour. The world had become too small, too fast, too interwoven. In cities, standardized time brought new rhythms. Factory whistles replaced roosters. Office workers punched in at 9 and out at 5. Bells rang in schools not for prayer, but for recess. The minute hand ruled the day. And with each passing decade, life became more synchronized. Trains left on time. Banks opened at the hour. Children were born, married, buried, all with clocks bearing witness. The language changed. What time is it? Became a daily question, sometimes an anxious one. The sun still rose and set, but few people checked its position anymore. They checked the clock. But as time became standardized, it also became abstract. Local noon, once a warm sliver of sunlight directly overhead, was now a number. Noon could happen when the sun still slanted across the rooftops. Midnight might come when people were wide awake beneath electric light. The natural cues were severed. The sun no longer defined the hour defined itself. For farmers, this could feel jarring. For travelers, confusing. But for businesses, militaries, and governments, it was a marvel. Trains ran on time. Telegraphs stamped their transmissions. Banks across oceans could close their ledgers in harmony. This global standardization also paved the way for global conflict and cooperation. Wars were planned with synchronized watches. Armies moved in lockstep. Stock exchanges opened in London and closed in Tokyo, each linked by the ticking of international time. The 20th century belonged to the clock, and in that world, precision was power. Yet even as clocks ruled the day, people began to push back. The rise of daylight saving time in the early 20th century was both a concession to nature and a manipulation of it. By shifting the hour forward, in summer, governments aimed to conserve energy, give workers more daylight, and align human schedules with seasonal light, but the result was further abstraction. Twice a year, people changed their clocks, adjusting not to the sun, but to policy. In some countries, time became not only standardized but negotiable. Today, the global clock is kept not by sun or star, but by atoms. Atomic clocks, counting the oscillations of cesium or rubidium, measure time so precisely that they would not gain or lose a second in millions of years. Satellites in Earth's orbit beam time signals to our phones, guiding everything, From financial markets to GPS navigation, every moment is time-stamped, every transaction logged. Time has become digital, invisible, omnipresent. And yet, for all its precision, something has been lost. The intimacy of local time, the warmth of a bell struck by hand, the slow awareness of light changing in the sky. These have given way to ticking digits, automated reminders, notifications. We wake not with dawn, but with alarms. We eat not when we're hungry, but when the schedule says so. We rush, we plan, we regret. We say we don't have time, as if it were a purse we forgot to bring. But time is not lost. It is simply hidden beneath layers of mechanism and screen. Still, in quiet moments, we remember. We stand on a hill at dusk and watch the sun drop below the horizon. We wake before the alarm, sensing the coming light. We hear a church bell, somewhere far, and we pause. Time, for all its standardization, still belongs to the soul. It is in the beating of a heart, in the hush before dawn, in the long, slow turning of the earth. The global clock may tell us when, but it cannot tell us why. The train demanded standard time. The telegraph demanded simultaneity. The world responded with zones and signals. But beneath all that, the ancient rhythms remain. And perhaps the future will not be about escaping the clock, but remembering what it once served. A life lived in step with light, with breath, with wonder. There was a time when to know the hour, one had to look up, to the sky, to a bell tower, to the angle of shadows cast across the earth. Then came the public clocks, ringing out across cities, mounted in towers like sentinels of a new age. Time had been tethered to place. It lived in cathedrals, train stations, and factories. But soon, time would become something smaller, something more intimate. It would be held in a hand, slipped into a pocket, strapped to a wrist. The clock was about to become personal. And with that change came a transformation not just in how humans mark the hours, but how they felt them, carried them, inside themselves. The 16th century saw the earliest stirrings of this transformation. As the mechanical clock matured in monasteries and cities, its miniature cousin began to emerge. These first portable timekeepers were not yet precise, nor were they common. Called clock watches, they were marvels of engineering for their time, small drum-shaped objects powered by spring mechanisms, often worn on a chain or carried in clothing. These were not tools for the commoner. They were luxury items, symbols of wealth, status, and curiosity. Kings and scholars might own one. The average citizen, not yet. The technology was delicate, the mechanics crude by today's standards, but the idea had taken hold. Time could be carried. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the pocket watch had become the emblem of gentlemanly precision. Encased in gold or silver, decorated with enamel or intricate filigree, they were both ornament and instrument. Still, they required regular winding. They lost minutes by the day. But for merchants, ship captains, and scholars, they were revolutionary. One no longer needed to glance at a distant tower or wait for the church bell. Now, time sat in your waistcoat, ticking just out of sight, whispering its passage with every second-hand sweep. The gears were hidden, but the implications were not. Time had drawn closer. It had become a possession, something you could own, protect, consult. And in that ownership came a quiet shift. People began to see their lives not just in days and seasons, but in hours, minutes, and seconds. As the Industrial Revolution unfurled its smoke-streaked banners across the 19th century, the need for personal timekeeping became urgent. Factory workers were expected to arrive on the dot. Conductors needed to coordinate stops across rail networks. Soldiers, engineers, telegraph operators, all found that life now moved to the beat of precision. But reaching into one's pocket during labor was impractical. Time had to be visible, instantly. It needed to be closer still. Enter the wristwatch. At first, it was a novelty, a woman's accessory, dainty and decorative. Men, tied to tradition and the weight of masculine utility, scoffed. The pocket watch was enough. But war has a way of bending habits. During the late 19th century and into the First World War, military officers realized the wristwatch's utility on the battlefield. It was quicker, safer, more reliable in the chaos of combat. Coordinating artillery strikes, synchronizing advances, these tasks required second-level accuracy. Soldiers began strapping watches to their wrists, often fashioning them from modified pocket watches with leather straps. What had begun as a fashion statement became a matter of life and death. And when the war ended, the wristwatch came home. It stayed. Men no longer saw it as feminine or frivolous. They saw it as essential. With mass production techniques improving, wristwatches became affordable. They spread across the classes. A worker, a clerk, a schoolboy, all could own one. The wristwatch was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity. And its face, round, numbered, ticking, became a constant presence. People began to check their watch not just for trains or appointments, but for reassurance. What time is it? How much time do I have? Am I late? These questions crept into daily consciousness like ivy over stone. Time had moved from the cathedral into the wrist, from the cosmos into the pulse. Meanwhile, the alarm clock took root in bedrooms. Its bell was not like the church's call to prayer or the factory's summons. It was personal. It rang beside your bed, yanking you from sleep with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. It was the new rooster, mechanized, merciless. For many, it was the first sound they heard each morning. It marked the boundary between dream and duty. The first mass-produced alarm clocks appeared in the mid-19th century, and by the early 20th, nearly every home in the industrialized world had one. They came in brass, in bakelite, in plastic. Some ticked, some buzzed, some glowed in the dark. All of them marked the final descent of time into the private sphere. The clock now lived where you slept, where you breathed. But even as watches and alarms drew time inward, humans began to discover that they had always carried a clock, hidden deep within. The internal clock, the circadian rhythm, that ancient, invisible pulse that tells the body when to wake, when to eat, when to sleep. Long before gears or pendulums, our ancestors rose with light and slept with darkness. They sensed hunger not by schedule, but by need. Scientists in the 20th century, placing volunteers in windowless bunkers, discovered that even without any external cues, the body kept time. Sleep cycles, hormone levels, body temperature, all followed an innate 24-hour rhythm. The body remembered the sun, even when it could not see it. This internal clock is sensitive, intricate, and not so easily overridden. Jet lag, shift work, insomnia, all arise when the body's time is misaligned with society's. In a world where alarms shout and screens glow into the night, many people now live in conflict with their own rhythms. We eat at odd hours. We sleep too little. We wake too early. We override fatigue with caffeine. We battle sleep with blue light. And in doing so, we forget that the first clock we ever knew was the one inside us. Yet some still listen to it. Farmers who rise before dawn feel its pull. Monks in remote monasteries follow its rise and fall in their prayers. Travelers, waking, without alarms, find themselves stirred by sunlight on their skin. Even in cities, some people step out at dusk and feel the world slowing. The body knows. It always has. In the 21st century, timekeeping has become almost invisible. We no longer need to wear watches. Our phones keep perfect time, synced by atomic clocks orbiting the Earth. Every message, every transaction, every step is stamped with precision. Time lives in our pockets, our dashboards, our walls, our wrists, even our refrigerators and microwaves. It counts our steps, tracks our heartbeats, reminds us to stand. It wakes us, schedules us, nags us, but we barely notice. Time has moved from something sacred and observed to something constant and managed, and now something ambient. And yet, for all its omnipresence, the yearning for slower time remains. People buy analog watches not because they're necessary, but because they're beautiful. They mark anniversaries with heirloom timepieces, not because they need the hour, but because they need the meaning. Some return to sundials, to hourglasses, to candles with burn marks. Some, tired of alarms, rise with the sun. Others switch their phones to silent, leaving the clock behind, if only for a day. Because deep down, we know that time is not merely what ticks. It is what matters. The rise of personal time did more than make us punctual. It changed how we lived. It trained us to think in hours. It trained us to feel late, to rush, to plan. But it also made time intimate. It made it ours. When a watch was given as a gift, it was more than a tool. It said, "I want you to have time. I want you to remember this moment." And maybe that is the final truth of the wristwatch, the alarm clock, and the clock within us. They all remind us that time, though measured, is still a mystery. That each second, each breath, is something we carry, not because we must, but because we can. There was once a time when waiting was part of life. You waited for the sun to rise. You waited for the moon to swell. You waited for the seasons to shift and the birds to return and the bells to toll. Time was something you felt as a rhythm, as a breath, as a procession of changes. But slowly the rhythm was replaced by the tick, and the tick by the beep, and the beep by the invisible pulse of electrons. Now, in the 21st century, we live in an age where waiting is disappearing. Not because time has changed, but because we have. We've taken time apart second by second, millisecond by millisecond, until it has become too fast to feel. And in this new world of digital time, atomic clocks, and nanosecond precision, we must ask not just how we measure time, but whether we still know how to live in it. The story of atomic time begins not in the sky, but in the atom. As early as the 20th century, scientists were searching for something more reliable than the rotation of the Earth or the swinging of a pendulum. Our old measures, noble though they were, proved imperfect. The Earth wobbles, pendulums slow, gears wear down. The sun, once our most trusted guide, rises a few seconds differently each day. We needed a new authority, one untouched by the natural world, and we found it deep inside matter itself. In 1949, the first atomic clock was built in the United States. It was based on the vibrations of ammonia molecules, tiny, invisible tremors repeating at unimaginably fast speeds. But that was only the beginning. In 1955, British scientists unveiled the first cesium beam atomic clock, which would go on to redefine the second itself. No longer was a second the fraction of a day. It was now the time it takes for a cesium atom to oscillate, 9,192,731,170 times. That number became the heartbeat of the world. Cesium clocks were accurate to within a second every million years. Later, clocks using hydrogen masers and optical lattice technology would become even more precise, gaining or losing a second only once every 100 million years, then a billion. Time, once drawn from stars and shadow, now came from labs, from vacuum chambers and lasers. These clocks were kept deep underground, behind locked doors and humming servers. And yet their heartbeat was heard everywhere, in GPS satellites, internet servers, airport navigation systems, financial trades, and even in your phone. Every second you live is tracked by atoms. The world we live in now is ruled by Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, maintained by a constellation of atomic clocks around the planet, all synchronized to within billionths of a second. GPS satellites, orbiting the Earth, carry their own atomic clocks, constantly broadcasting their precise positions and timestamps. Your phone listens to them without your knowing, calculating where you are by how long it takes the signals to arrive. Light takes time to travel, even if only a microsecond, and your position on Earth is known by measuring that tiny difference. Every map app, every step tracker, every delivery update, it all runs on time carved out of the smallest vibrations in the universe. Time has become so fast it's gone silent. It no longer ticks. It pulses. It updates. You don't watch it anymore. You absorb it. It streams into your devices constantly, invisibly. Your photos are time-stamped. Your messages, your steps, your heartbeats, all recorded, logged, archived. Even the stock market now trades in microseconds. Algorithms compete for trades not by the second, but by the millionth of one. Servers are moved closer to data centers, just to shave off the tiniest lag. In this world, whoever is fastest wins. Not stronger, not wiser, faster. But speed has a cost. The faster we go, the less we feel. Time, once a procession of events and changes, has become a grid, something we fit things into, rather than something we live within. We schedule ourselves down to the minute. We multitask. We refresh, reload, stream. We check how many minutes remain in the episode. We complain when the download takes 5 seconds. We tap impatiently when the light turns yellow. We ask how long the line is before we even join it. Waiting, once a part of being alive, has become an inconvenience, a glitch in the machine. And so we fill the waiting. Where once we might have looked at the sky or let the mind wander, now we fill the seconds with content. We check our phones in elevators, in queues at red lights. We scroll through 10-second videos. We watch movies at 1.5x speed. Even our leisure is accelerated. And when the content stops, when the battery dies, or the signal cuts out, we feel something terrifying, the unstructured moment. Silence, idleness, time, raw and unmeasured. Yet our bodies still remember a different rhythm, our circadian. Clocks, older than any civilization, still rise and fall with light. Our hearts beat not in nanoseconds, but in slow, steady percussion. When we close our eyes, when we walk without headphones, when we sit by a window and simply breathe, the old time returns. The world slows. The mind drifts. We notice the way the light changes across the wall. We hear the wind. We feel the weight of time again, not as something to beat, but as something to belong to. In some corners of science, time is being reimagined yet again. Quantum physicists speak of time not as a constant flow, but as something emergent, relational, perhaps even illusory. Time may not pass at all in the deepest levels of reality. What we experience may be the result of entropy, of things changing state, not of some universal clock ticking in the background. In this view, time is not a river, but a shadow cast by change. If nothing changed, there would be no time. Artificial, intelligence and machine learning now predict your next appointment, your sleep cycles, your reminders. Timekeeping has moved from measurement to prediction. Your devices don't just tell you the time, they anticipate your next moment. Smart homes adjust lighting based on habits. Cars suggest departure times. Calendars fill themselves. And so the question grows sharper. If we no longer keep time, but are kept by it, what happens to our humanity? There are some who resist. Movements like slow living, digital minimalism, and even modern monasticism are pushing back against the tyranny of the microsecond. They cook without timers. They walk without GPS. They write letters instead of sending messages. Not because they hate technology, but because they want to reclaim presence. They want to feel time again, to wait, to wonder, to wander. Because maybe the end of waiting isn't progress. Maybe it's amnesia. Maybe in forgetting how to wait, we forget how to long, how to savor, how to hope. Maybe we need the pause between questions, the silence before the song, the darkness before the dawn, the waiting room of the soul where nothing is certain and everything is possible. Atomic clocks will continue to improve. One day, we may measure time to the trillionth of a second. We may build quantum clocks that bend even our understanding of duration. But perhaps the most important timekeeping will always be the one we carry in memory. In the stories we tell, in the moments we choose to hold, a dinner that lingers past midnight, a walk that lasts until the sky softens, a breath held not to count seconds, but to feel them. Time began as shadow and starlight. Then it became bells, then gears, then quartz, then atoms. Now, it flickers in pixels and pulses in networks. But beneath it all, time remains what it always was, the space between becoming and being, between question and answer, between birth and death. And maybe, just maybe, in remembering how we told time before. Clocks, we remember how to live inside it again. Time, we often think, is neutral, impartial, universal, steady. It is the one thing no one owns, the one thing we all share. But this has never been true. From the earliest calendars to the ticking of satellite-guided clocks, time has always had a master. It has been shaped, structured, and enforced not merely to help people live, but to make them obey. To control time is to control behavior. To determine when people rise, when they work, when they worship, when they sleep, when they marry, when they pay taxes, when they die. Time has been the silent tool of rulers, priests, empires, and corporations. Whoever draws the line between 1 hour and the next defines the world between them. Long before the digital age, power lay in the hands of those who knew the sky. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests held the knowledge of the stars and the calendar. Their temples were not only houses of worship, but observatories. They alone knew when the rains would come, when the moon would renew, when to plant, and when to sacrifice. In their hands, time became a sacred language. The people followed because they believed, but also because they feared. To defy the calendar was to defy the gods, and by extension, the state. The calendar was not just a tool, it was a law, written in stars and enforced by ritual. The Egyptians bound time to kingship. Pharaohs ruled through the concept of ma'at, cosmic balance, and their control over time was part of that divine order. The rising of Sirius, the flood of the Nile, the opening of the agricultural season, all were bound together in a temporal hierarchy that reinforced the authority of the throne. Even death was timed, as tombs aligned with stars and embalmers followed lunar schedules to the hour. Time flowed downward, from the gods to the king, from the king to the priesthood, and from the priesthood to the people. Rome gave us the calendar in a form we still know today, but even this was a political act. Julius Caesar, frustrated by the corruption and chaos of lunar mismanagement, introduced the Julian calendar in 45 BCE. It was a reform and a statement. The new calendar bore his name. The month of July was his. Later, Augustus would take August. Time was branded, and every reform that followed, from Gregorian adjustments to leap year tinkering, served both mathematical need and imperial will. The Pope who decreed the Gregorian calendar reform in 1582 did not merely fine-tune time. He chose which countries would follow Rome and when. Protestant nations resisted, viewing the Catholic calendar as a symbol of foreign domination. For decades, Europe could not even agree on what day it was. The mechanical clock, as it spread across medieval Europe, was more than a tool of monastic devotion. It became a tool of urban governance. City clocks dictated when markets opened, when workers reported, when laws were enforced. Bell towers told people when they were allowed to live. Those who controlled the bell controlled the crowd. Time became part of the state. It was no longer natural. It was imposed. With the rise of industrial capitalism, time became currency. Factory owners demanded punctuality, and the whistle became a weapon. Workers were no longer judged by what they produced, but by how many hours they gave. The punch clock arrived, stamping every entrance and exit with mechanical impartiality. But the clock was never neutral. It served the bosses. It measured compliance. It was precise, but not just. The man who owned the clock decided how much a minute was worth. And when your shift began to tick before the sun rose, time no longer felt like a gift. It became a chain. Colonialism extended this control across oceans. European empires brought not only guns and laws, but calendars and clocks. Indigenous time, seasonal, spiritual, ceremonial, was dismissed as primitive. Missionaries enforced the 7-day week. Administrators enforced the fiscal year. Railroads brought time zones carved not by geography but by convenience. The colonies were ordered to tick to the clock of London or Paris. In India, local lunar calendars were replaced with British timetables. In Africa, rhythms of migration and harvest were replaced by wage labor and work weeks. The colonizer didn't just steal land. He stole time. The 20th century made time global, but also more tightly controlled. World wars required synchronization at an unimaginable scale. Armies moved by the second. Bombs fell with timed precision. Governments issued blackout schedules and ration timings. Even civilian life bent to the military clock. After the war, corporations adopted the same logic. Supply chains ran on just-in-time delivery. Offices became temples of productivity. And leisure? That too was scheduled. Lunch breaks, TV time slots, vacation windows. Your calendar, once a blank space, became a battlefield. Then came the screen. Computers, smartphones, and digital assistants don't just measure time, they predict it. Your browser knows when you usually check the news. Your app knows when you'll need a reminder. Your calendar syncs across continents. Your emails carry timestamps across hemispheres. Algorithms push content to you based on patterns of time you're not even aware of. You're nudged, not ordered, but suggested. And yet the effect is the same. You act when time tells you. Only now, you don't know who made the clock. Power has become more subtle. No one rings the bell, but you wake when your phone chirps. You eat when the schedule opens. You stream what's released on the hour. And if the app delays a second, you feel it. The illusion is that you are in control, that your calendar belongs to you. But every platform is a timekeeper. Every company is a clockmaker, and every moment is being watched. Even resistance has its schedules. Revolutions are live-streamed. Protests are announced on social media at 3 p.m. local time. Hashtags surge, then fade, their momentum measured in minutes. If you don't act fast, you miss the moment. In this world, silence is forgetfulness. Delay is irrelevance. To be seen is to be timed. And yet, time remains our deepest resource. It is the one thing everyone has, but no one owns. You can be born into wealth, but you cannot buy more days. You can live slowly, even in a fast world. You can pause. You can disconnect. You can turn the phone face down and feel the hour expand. Because the truth is this: whoever controls the clock shapes the culture. But you still choose what you do with your hour. Time was never ours to begin with. It did not ask to be measured. It did not cry out to be divided. It lived long before we named it. It pulsed in the tide, in the sap of trees, in the slow dance of stars. It whispered in the turning of leaves and the stillness before storms. Long before calendars and quartz, before pendulums and pressure springs, before sand slipped through glass or atoms buzzed in vacuum, time simply was. And we, small and wondering, tried to catch it. We watched the sky, and from its language we wrote our first myths. We traced shadows and called them hours. We watched the moon and called it a month. We counted winters by scars and harvests by memory. Our ancestors lived by rhythm, not schedule. They felt time as warmth and hunger, as song and silence, as the breath between one story and the next. And somewhere along the way, we changed. We tamed time, or tried to. We caged it in numbers. We wound it into gears. We carved it into slices. We stacked it into years. We worshipped it. We feared it. We sold it. And now, here we are, surrounded by time and somehow always running out of it. We check the clock 100 times a day. We sync, we schedule, we rush. We call it freedom, yet measure it like currency. We dream of saving time while wasting hours. We have calendars filled with names and alarms that interrupt our breathing. We chase seconds while losing days. But time has not left us. It waits. Beneath the tick, beneath the screen, beneath the noise. It waits in the quiet spaces, in a leaf trembling in wind, in the hush before snow, in the pause after laughter. It waits in the warmth of sun on your back, in the long silence of reading by a window, in the moment you forget the hour. To return to time is not to abandon the clock. It is to see through it, to understand that the clock is a tool, not a law, that the calendar is a compass, not a prison, that your hour is yours. It always was. So watch the shadows. Listen to the rain. Let a meal stretch without end. Let sleep come when it will. Step outside without your phone. Count stars, not steps. Light a candle and let it burn until it forgets to be wax. Mark the day not by what you did, but by what you felt. Because before time was measured, it was lived. And it can be again. The clock will keep ticking, whether or not you listen. But your life, your one brief flame in the long story of time, will not. So make it slow. Make it wide. Make it yours. And so you sit there, perhaps still, perhaps swaying slightly in your chair or on your side in bed, your fingers curled lightly against a blanket or a cup or your own palm. You haven't moved much, and yet something inside you has softened. You can feel the world exhaling, not rushing to the next obligation, not breaking the stillness with sound. Just this, a pause that holds no punishment. This, too, is time. You don't often meet it like this. Not without a screen between you. Not without something to do, or scroll through, or finish. But now it's here, bare and slow and quiet. And it asks you nothing. Not to be productive. Not to be correct. Not to be prepared. It just stands beside you, like a companion who doesn't speak, but whose presence keeps the loneliness at bay. For time is not always ticking. Sometimes it's just waiting with you. There are parts of the world that still know how to live like this, places where the day bends around the sun, not the other way around. Villages where the rooster is still the first alarm, and the breeze at dusk is still the signal that the work is done. Places where the time is told not in numbers, but in gestures. The children returning from the field, the kettle set on the stove, the way the shadows lean long across the road just before dinner. These places are not outside of time. They are inside it, deep inside it, where it is warm and wide and forgiving. But you don't have to go far to find that rhythm again. Sometimes you find it in the way your cat stretches in a sunbeam, in the way old friends talk slowly on the phone, with long pauses that would feel awkward anywhere else, in the way a child tells a story without ever hurrying to the end. You hear it in the hum of the refrigerator late at night, in the hush that falls over a house when the last light is turned off, in the moments that feel like music, even if there is no sound. This is what returning to time really means. Not stepping back, but stepping in. Letting time hold you, rather than chasing it. You might remember moments like this, little ones. The way your grandfather took his time slicing fruit. The way your grandmother tied her apron without looking. The slow way the sun moved across your classroom wall when you were a child, and you measured the day by the warmth on your desk. Maybe you remember summer evenings when the day lingered, and nobody had anything urgent to do. Maybe there were fireflies, or maybe just the soft flicker of a television set turned down low, and the sound of someone you loved humming to themselves in the kitchen. No one said, "This is sacred," but you knew. You didn't know it then, but time had stopped, trying to be measured. It had gone soft, stretchy, luminous, and all you had to do was be in it. That's the truth no clock can teach us, that time isn't always a ladder of tasks. Sometimes it's a field, a bath, a slow walk through a memory you didn't know you still carried. Sometimes it's what happens between the seconds, in the gaps, in the breaths, in the spaces that don't get scheduled, the parts you can't photograph, the parts no algorithm can predict. Because even now, in a world where time is a number stamped on every notification, every email, every receipt, the deepest times are still the ones that go unmarked. The moments that sneak in through the back door of your day. The silence between words when you sit with someone you love. The glance between strangers on a train. The way someone pauses before saying something they're afraid won't be understood. The way you close your eyes and suddenly remember a smell you haven't smelled in years. These are the unclocked moments. They are not gone. They are only quiet. And they wait for you, like old friends. The trouble is, we're not taught to see time this way. We're taught to fill it, to race it, to spend it like money and fear its loss like death. But what if time wasn't something you lost, but something you found? What if the real treasure wasn't what you did with your time, but what your time did to you when you let it unfold without fear? We speak so often about wasting time, but maybe the waste is in fearing the slow, in rushing through the very hours that would have healed us, had we only let them linger. We move fast, trying to find meaning, not realizing that meaning often only shows itself when we stop moving long enough for it to catch up. Think of the way a garden grows. It cannot be rushed. You cannot force a tomato to ripen faster with a deadline. You cannot schedule a tree into bloom. The earth knows this. The moon knows this. Even your body knows this. It heals in silence. It renews itself in rest. It ages, not by numbers, but by lived experience. And yet we drag it through the hours, faster and faster, until we collapse. And then we call that exhaustion progress. But progress is not always speed. Sometimes it is stillness. Sometimes it is presence. Sometimes it is the radical act of saying no. Not because you are lazy or behind, but because you want to be here for your own life. You want to feel your coffee warming your hands. You want to watch the steam rise and not reach for a screen. You want to hear your own breath and not panic at its quietness. You want to rest without needing to earn it, because you are already enough. You are already on time. You always were. And what is time really, if not a mirror? It reflects what we pay attention to. It stretches when we are present. It slips through our fingers when we are distracted. An hour spent in silence can feel like an ocean. An hour spent refreshing. Screens can vanish without a trace. We blame time for moving too fast. But perhaps it's not time that moves. Perhaps it's us. Perhaps we are the ones racing ahead, afraid of what we might feel if we slowed down long enough to actually arrive. There are whole worlds inside the quiet hour, worlds you may not have entered in years. The room in your mind where old memories sit, not dusty, not forgotten, just waiting for the right silence to bloom again. Maybe it's a scent that opens the door, the smell of something baking, or rain on concrete, or an old book's breath. And suddenly you are not in this hour anymore. You are 10 years old again, or 20. You are in a room that no longer exists, beside someone who is no longer here, hearing the way they said your name, the way the floor creaked, the way the sun looked on that particular afternoon. That's time too. Time not as measurement, but as memory, as presence made visible in the mind's rearview mirror. These are the moments we never schedule, but they shape us more than the ones we do. You don't mark them in a planner, you don't check them off. But they come back, again and again, asking quietly to be felt. And if you listen, really listen, they'll show you something important, that not all time is equal. That some moments carry more weight, more color, more truth than entire weeks of noise. And they often happen in the in-between. The in-between is sacred, between night and morning, between task and rest, between question and answer, between one chapter of life and the next. These liminal spaces, soft, uncertain, unproductive, are where transformation begins. Where we shed the versions of ourselves that no longer fit, and sit, unclothed of titles and roles, in the raw light of becoming. These spaces are not efficient. They do not produce results. They are not useful by modern standards. And, yet, they are where we find ourselves. We have forgotten how to honor the in-between. We try to fill every gap, to optimize, to move from one thing to the next, without letting the silence echo. But silence is not emptiness. It is the chamber in which truth resounds. It is in silence that grief speaks, that joy catches its breath, that wonder tiptoes in, that love says what words cannot. If we never pause, we miss the moment after the moment, the part where meaning settles. Think of the way a song ends, not with the last note, but with the quiet that follows. That hush is part of the song. Think of the way two people fall into each other's eyes and say nothing. That silence is part of the conversation. Think of the way a snowfall blankets everything. Not saying, not asking, just being. That stillness is part of the storm's story. Without the in-between, time becomes flat, lifeless. Just a list of events without the breath between them. So what if we practiced something different? What if, just for today, we let time be soft again? What if we honored the pause instead of fearing it? What if we treated stillness not as a void, but as a vessel? There are people who live like this, quietly resisting the rush. Gardeners who talk to their plants. Artists who paint for hours without noticing the sun has moved. Musicians who lose track of meals. Elders who sit on porches and watch the wind. Children who stare at dust motes like galaxies. None of them are wasting time. They are inhabiting it. You can do it too. You don't need a cabin in the woods. You don't need to throw away your phone or flee to the mountains. You just need to give yourself permission. Permission to not respond right away. Permission to stare out the window. Permission to take longer to walk somewhere. Permission to feel things as they happen, even if they don't fit the schedule. Permission to be slow, soft, human. Because time, real time, isn't measured in hours. It's measured in presence. And presence doesn't rush. You may find, as you slow down, that emotions begin to surface, ones you didn't know were waiting. Because speed is a blanket, and silence peels it back. In the quiet, you remember. You feel the grief that had no time to land. You hear the echo of joy you brushed past too quickly. You notice the soft ache of longing for something you haven't named. This is not a problem to fix. This is time doing its deeper work, giving you back the pieces of yourself you abandoned to urgency. We don't always realize what we've lost until we stop. The feel of unhurried touch, the taste of food that wasn't rushed, the voice of someone who once spoke gently without being interrupted. The luxury of listening to a full story, not just the headline. These things are not small. They are the threads that weave a life, a real life. One that remembers what it means to be a person, not just a producer. Think of the last time you looked at someone and truly saw them, not as a task or a conversation or a mirror of yourself, but as a soul suspended in time beside yours. How rare that is now. How easily we miss each other, brushing past in the hallway of hours. But when we slow, when we give our attention like a gift, we notice more than faces. We notice time itself, reaching out between us. Time isn't just what passes between birth and death. It's what pulses in a held hand, in the pause before laughter, in the silence shared by those who understand each other without speaking. That's the real time we're returning to. Not the chronological, not the mechanical, but the deeply human. There are words in other languages for this kind of time. In Japanese, there's ma, the space between. In Hawaiian, kalana, a time of calm and reflection. In Portuguese, saudade, the ache of remembering something sweet that can never return. These are not just concepts. They are doorways. They remind us that time is not always forward. It can spiral. It can return. It can stretch. And so can we. Maybe that's what healing is. A return not to some fixed point, but to a slower rhythm. A rejoining of ourselves with our own life. Noticing again the patterns that once brought comfort. The tea ritual, the daily walk, the way you used to hum when no one was around. These are not luxuries. They are anchors. They are how time tells you who you are. Even nature tells time this way. Trees do not rush. Their years are marked in rings, not appointments. Tides come not with alarms, but with the moon's steady tug. Flowers bloom, not when we want them to, but when the warmth says it's time. And somehow, they're always on time. So why are we so afraid to move at the speed of life? There is a peace that lives only in slowness, a kind of joy that cannot be bought or scheduled or streamed. It arrives like morning fog, quietly, gradually, filling the spaces we forgot we needed. You don't chase it. You make room for it. You open the window. You leave the hour empty. You listen. And maybe slowly, something comes back to you. Not from the future, but from before. From before you were this busy, this overwhelmed, this out of breath. It was always there, this softer time. Waiting, still warm. You might begin to see your own life differently as time softens around you. Not as a straight line, but as a field, full of echoes, loops, places you've passed through more than once, even if you didn't realize it. That conversation you had years ago that still lives in your mind like a lantern lit. That childhood walk home that returns to you when the light hits the pavement just right. That one moment of stillness that taught you more than any lecture. Time, when left unchained, loops back to feed us again. And somewhere inside you, that child still lives. The one who once had entire afternoons with no agenda, who played until the stars came out, who lost hours in imagination without ever checking the clock. That child didn't measure worth by output, That child didn't ask, "Is this productive?" before dreaming. That child knew how to be in time without breaking it into pieces. You didn't lose that part of yourself. It only went quiet, waiting for the hour when you'd remember how to listen. To return to time is to return to that child, to walk slowly enough that they can catch up with you again. You may be older now. The mirror may no longer reflect the same softness, but the spirit of unmeasured wonder, of present play, of quiet awe, it is not gone. It is waiting for the hour when you will finally stop rushing long enough to hear it breathe again. We often speak of time as something we fight. We say it slips away, that we can't hold on to it, that it steals youth, that it robs us of chances. But what if time isn't the thief? What if we are? What if we steal from ourselves every time we treat a quiet moment as worthless? What if we're the ones robbing ourselves by refusing to rest, to be still, to stay? Aging, too, takes on new meaning in this gentler light. It is not a loss of time. It is an accumulation. Wrinkles are not failures. They are records, lines on a face, yes, but also lines in a poem that only you could write. Years are not weights. They are songs. And those who live slowly often hear melodies the rest of us miss. We think of legacy as what we leave behind after we're gone. But maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe legacy is the way you made someone feel on an ordinary Tuesday, the way your laughter filled a room without asking for anything in return, the way you once paused to help someone cross a street, and they remembered it every day after. Maybe your real legacy is not what you built, but how you moved through time, and how your presence made it feel safe for others to slow down too. You won't always remember the schedule. You won't always remember the meetings, the chores, the rush. But you will remember how the sunlight hit the kitchen floor that day. You'll remember the way someone looked at you when the world had gone quiet. You'll remember a song played while your head was on someone's shoulder. These are not uses of time. They are the proof that you were here, that you didn't just move through time. You lived in it, and time remembers you too. Every footstep, every whisper, every breath becomes part of the world's long memory. The wind carries it. The earth keeps it. And long after the clock has stopped ticking, the time you spent well, the time you spent real, continues. Maybe not in records, but in ripples. And now we live in a world built to interrupt. Time has been shattered into pieces, seconds, milliseconds, notifications, updates. We live among blinking lights and scrolling feeds, each one promising urgency. There is always something new. Always something now. The moment we try to rest, the machine chirps again. A message, a reminder, a red dot on the edge of our vision. And though we think we're choosing it, most days it chooses us. The rhythm of our lives begins to match the rhythm of machines. Fast, reactive, fractured. But your body was never meant to live like this. Your breath was not designed to match the speed of signal towers. Your heart was not made to respond to vibrations in your pocket. The most vital parts of you, your blood, your dreams, your memory, your healing, all happen in slowness, in sleep, in silence, in stillness. And if we forget this, we don't become more efficient. We become less human. So you begin, perhaps, by doing less. By turning the phone face down. By closing the laptop before the screen tells you it's time. By stepping away from the scrolling and into the world of the senses. Because your senses are old. Older than the internet. Older than electricity. They remember what you forgot. They are the doorways back to time. You notice, maybe for the first time in weeks, how quiet the room is when you stop filling it. You notice the birds. You notice the sound of your own voice when it isn't performing. You notice that your shoulders are higher than they need to be. and you let them fall. You notice the way the light settles on your desk, like it's been trying to speak to you all morning. And then you breathe. Not a shallow, anxious breath, a full one. A breath that belongs to no one but you. A breath that does not ask for anything. A breath that simply is. And in that moment, time returns. Not the time on the clock, not the digital one blinking on your screen, but the deep time, the timeless time. The time that watches you grow old, the time that holds your grandmother's recipes, your father's hands, your mother's lullabies. The time that remembers you from before you could name yourself. The time that waits quietly outside the noise, like a friend who was never in a hurry. You may find as you return to it that life feels less like a race and more like a walk. A walk through a garden that changes every day, sometimes blooming, sometimes bare, sometimes wet with grief, sometimes golden with joy. You walk slower now, because you're finally seeing the details. The softness in your friend's voice, the way your dog's ears twitch in sleep, the way tea tastes different when you're not multitasking, and you begin to trust again, not in the world's schedule, but in your own rhythm, your own unfolding. You begin to believe that rest is not a reward, but a right, that pleasure is not a sin, that waiting is not a waste, that life, when fully lived, doesn't need to be timed to be meaningful. Time is not only personal, it is also shared. There is the time we hold alone, and then there is the time we pass between us, like a flame passed from candle to candle, hand to hand, moment to moment. And in that shared time, we find something even more mysterious, a rhythm that doesn't belong to any one person, but to us. Think of how people move together, how a crowd hushes before a concert begins, how dancers mirror each other without speaking, how voices rise in unison during a song sung from memory. In those moments, something ancient returns. We remember how to be part of something bigger than our own story. We remember how time used to be told by fireside stories, not just clocks, by drum beats, by footsteps, by silence shared across a field at dusk. This shared time lives in community. It lives in family dinners that stretch into night, in the ritual of making tea for someone without being asked, in the passing of tools from one hand to another, in the knowing glance between two people who have seen each other through many seasons. You can feel it if you pay attention. The long thread of human time. Not your time, not my time, but ours. And in that thread is memory. Not just personal memory, but ancestral memory. The kind that lives in gestures. The way you stir soup the same way your mother did. The way your father folded his sleeves before lifting something heavy. The lullabies that stay in your blood long after the singer is gone. The holidays, the superstitions, the jokes that only make sense in your family. These are not just traditions. They are time speaking through you. We often forget this in the blur of the present. We think we're alone in our hours, but time is full of echoes. When you speak, someone long gone speaks with you. When you pause, someone far away pauses too. When you sit with your grief, you sit beside every human who has ever carried sorrow. There is comfort in that, in knowing you are never truly alone in time. You belong to a great tide, and tides, like time, always return. So perhaps, as we return to time, we also return to each other. We begin to look up more often. We begin to ask, "How are you?" and mean it. We begin to wait for the answer. We begin to listen, not just to words, but to pauses, to what is not said. Because time teaches us that presence is the most generous thing we can give, and the rarest, and in giving it, we create time. That is the great secret. Time is not something we have. It is something we make. in attention, in love, in witness. We make it when we slow down long enough for someone to feel seen. We make it when we write a letter by hand. When we sit quietly beside someone without needing to fill the silence. When we call just to say, "I was thinking of you." You may not remember what you did on a certain Tuesday 5 years ago, but someone else might remember how you made them feel. That is the kind of time that outlives the clock. That's the kind of time that matters. The truest clocks have no hands. They bloom. They fall. They migrate. They whisper in leaves. They live in the curve of the moon and the quiet tug of tides. Long before we etched numbers into stone or forged dials from brass, we told time by watching the world breathe. And though we've built cities to hide from the sky, the earth still keeps her rhythm and waits for us to remember. You can see it if you look. The way spring does not rush its entrance. The way the first green shoots appear without fanfare. The way birds return to their branches at almost the same moment every evening without consulting a clock. The way dusk gently pulls a shawl over the world's shoulders without ever asking permission. This is a time that does not hurry. A time that does not apologize for taking its shape. A time that keeps no record, and yet remembers everything. Our ancestors lived by this time. They knew when to plant, not from apps or charts, but from the feel of the air, the dampness of soil, the gossip of birds. They rose with the sun because it filled their homes with light. They ate when hungry, slept when tired, mourned with ceremony, and celebrated with the moon. They lived not against time, but within it, as part of its unfolding, not as its master. And somewhere in you, that rhythm remains. You may not be able to name it, but your body remembers. It remembers how to wake slowly, without alarms. It remembers how to move gently through dusk. It remembers how to grow quiet when the light fades. It remembers the difference between being still and being stuck. It remembers the rhythm of rain, of breath, of rest. You might feel it most in nature, in the woods, on the shore, in the quiet path behind your house where the weeds are allowed to speak. You feel it in the way your feet strike the earth when you walk slowly enough to hear your own footsteps. You feel it when the wind brushes your cheek, and there is nothing to do but close your eyes and let it. These are not luxuries. They are the original way of being. They are reminders. Because the natural world does not ask for productivity. It asks for presence. A tree does not rush its blooming. A river does not ask whether it's moving fast enough. The world is full of slow miracles, but they cannot be seen at high speed. That's why the most beautiful things often unfold in silence. The unfurling of a fern, the path of starlight across water, the way a fox pauses before stepping into a clearing. None of it happens in the language of urgency. All of it happens in the language of belonging. And if you stay long enough, you begin to speak that language again. Not fluently, not at first. But you remember how to listen. You remember how to stand still without guilt. You remember how to notice the ants, the clouds, the warmth of stone beneath your palm, the echo of your own heartbeat in a canyon of wind. And suddenly, time is no longer an enemy. It is a field you are walking through. It is a poem unfolding, one line at a time. It is the rhythm of life, not the measure of it. You are not behind. You are not late. You are simply arriving, again and again, into the only moment that ever truly exists. Not every hour is golden. Some stretch long and quiet, heavy with ache. And even in slowness, there are days that feel like fog, soft but disorienting. You may wonder, in those moments, if time is still a friend, if slowing down only brings you closer to the sadness you've been too busy to feel. And perhaps it does. But that's not a mistake. That's the healing. Because time, when honored gently, does not only bring us peace, it brings us truth. And sometimes that truth is that we are tired, that we are lonely, that we are holding too much, that we are afraid to stop moving because we're afraid of what stillness might say. But time does not come to scold. It comes to sit beside you, like a quiet companion who does not rush your tears, who waits for you to unfold at your own pace. There is no schedule for healing, no deadline for becoming whole again. The world might move fast, but your soul blooms slow, like moss, like lichen on a stone, like something that refuses to be hurried. And when you stop measuring your life by how quickly you bounce back, you begin to see that surviving, truly surviving, often looks like silence, like doing nothing productive for a while, like letting the ache speak until it's finished. Somewhere in that softness, time becomes a salve, not because it erases pain, but because it holds it gently, because it reminds you that this moment is not forever, and also that this moment is enough. Even the difficult ones, even the ones you wish you could skip, because they are yours. And to reject them would be to reject your own becoming. When you live in this kind of time, you begin to forgive yourself for not being farther along, for not always having the answers, for needing rest, for being human. You begin to see that slowness is not a failure. It's a kind of wisdom, that there is a strength in the unhurried, in the gentle, in the days that unfold like breath and end in quiet, instead of conquest. There are people in your life, perhaps, who have shown you this, not with words, but with presence. People who never rushed you to feel better, who let you speak in circles until the truth surfaced on its own. People who gave you their time like an open hand, not expecting anything, not measuring anything, just offering space. That is a sacred gift, one of the rarest. To offer time is to say, you are worth this hour. To accept time is to say, I am still becoming. And to live in time is to say, I do not need to arrive, I only need to be here. And so, dear listener, we arrive, not at an ending, but at a resting place. You've walked with me through centuries, through silence, through sundials and stars, through seasons and shadows and the soft beating of unmeasured hours. You've sat beside time, not to master it, but to listen. You've remembered that time was never the ticking thing on your wrist, or the red digits on your screen. Time was the rhythm in your breath, the hush before a storm, the flicker of memory in the quietest parts of your heart. And maybe, just maybe, something inside you has slowed. Maybe the world feels a little softer now. Maybe the clock feels less like a cage and more like a whisper. Maybe you'll rise tomorrow and notice something you hadn't before. The way light moves across the floor, or how tea tastes when you're not in a rush. Maybe you'll hold someone longer. Maybe you'll hold yourself longer. So before we part, I ask only this. Let the clock keep ticking, but don't let it own you. Let schedules exist, but don't let them erase your soul. Let time pass, but don't forget to live inside it. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not lost. You are right here. And this moment, this one, is yours. Unrushed, unmeasured, unrepeatable. So thank you for listening, for breathing, for being here with me. Wherever you are in the world, whatever hour this finds you. Good morning, good evening, and to those drifting off to sleep, good night. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are part of time, and time The real kind remembers you. Rest well, live gently. And when the noise begins again, just return. We'll be waiting.